If you come here for scientific talk, I'm afraid I'm not going to give you one. I'm just going to ramble on and discuss some of the things that we found while we were working at Tokai. Just for a little bit of history, this is Tokai Park over here. There, Orpen Road runs through there. We might as well get our bearings now because I'll be using this map quite a bit. So that's Orpen Road running there, the Dinnerdale parking over there. And this is what the park looked like in 2009. These are the Pinus radiata plantations. And these were the areas that were cleared. The core site, that's where the diastella was originally found. And at this stage, when the picture was taken, this area had been burnt as well. So a slightly bigger patch had been burnt. And this area was cleared. At the stage it was cleared, MTO wasn't certain whether they were going to go to another cycle of pines or whether they were going to hand it over to Sand Parks. So they decided to hold it back and think about it. So it never got burnt. It never got through the initial burning process. So this is a block that has been unburnt since 2005. We can see over here some interesting patterns. This is called third row thinning, which they do when they take out the poles between converting the crop from a crop of poles to trees for timber. And that has just been done over there in that block. And I think that's about all I want to show you is the Prinskasteel Wetland over here, the Ornithana over there, and the cycle track just off the screen over here, running over there. So this was the oldest plantation in the country. This is where it all began, our whole silvicultural thing, and this is where they experimented, mostly on the granite slopes, but over here as well. And we've had 3 cycles of pines and many experiments here at Tokai. Okay, we're also fortunate that we had Dr. Purcell at Bergvliet. Here's his farm. There's the Oog with a little stone island in the middle. And William Purcell spent the last twilight years of his life at his farm in Bergvliet and suffering from TB. And he spent his time collecting the plants at Bergvliet and making herbarium specimens from 1915 to 1919. He collected 595 species, which is a quarter of the peninsular flora, and 74 naturalized alien plants. Now, Bergvliet is right adjacent to Tokai, so it is an ideal reference source that we can actually see what should it be that we're aiming at, what are we trying to achieve at Tokai. So even though there's nothing left for us to use as a reference site, we have this excellent resource to try and work out what's going. And then we also had our volunteers. We've got Sybil Morris over here, and she spent many years in Tokai walking under the pine plantations and recording the different species in the block. So here we are, here are the different blocks. So you can see the highest area she found was the core site, the diastella patch, 166 species there, and then 109 in that unburned patch, which was exposed, and so the Fynbos was recovering when she was doing her study, but a few other species all through the plantation. We can see here all the blocks as well. We know the history of all of these blocks, how many cycles of pines they had, and what species of pines. And I must just point out block A18C over here. That was a block of very old pines. It's the only block that went through a 40-year cycle. So most of the others got extracted at 30 years, but this block went on to 40 years. And you can see compared to the block next to it, it's got a far fewer species. Which is an unfair comparison because this little ridge over here was very nice and open. It always had lots of light into it. So the Fynbos underneath managed to keep going for much longer than it did elsewhere in the plantation. So we had this old block and the much younger, more open stuff over there. So Sybil did an amazing job and really pioneered a lot of the work that happened. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, we became aware of just how critically endangered our ecosystems are. And these maps were produced showing that this is where Cape Flat sandflakes used to occur. That's Bloberg, what's left, and it's heavily transformed with aliens. But these other patches are all lost. They're all gone. And the only areas that are being conserved are in the green here. That's under the power lines over there, and here at Tokai and Kenilworth Racecourse. So just a very few places left to conserve, and Tokai is the only place south of the N2 that's big enough for actually conserving sand fynbos. And then Julia Wood, in her work in 1994, she looked at all the species here and drew up a list of the species that are confined to this vegetation type. And you can see it's a really rich flora, lots of threatened species, and 4 of them are already extinct. And then on the right, the Botanical Society started its core flora conservation site to see what needed conservation on the Cape Flats. And in 1997, they came up with a list of about 20 sites, and Tokai didn't feature. But in the revised edition, Tokai was number 17 out of the 37 sites in the core flora conservation sites on the Cape Flats. So these were the sites that had to be acquired if we were going to conserve this vegetation type. Okay, so basically we start off with what effectively was a pine plantation. And notice that even though in those days lots of people used it, it's not as heavily used as it is nowadays. And then it gets harvested and the slash lies down there, and then we have it burnt. And for those of you who have the adage that there is no smoke without fire, well, you haven't been to a sandbox burn. Here we can see lots of smoke and no fire. And unfortunately, they burn too late. They burn when it's too wet. And so as a rule, their fires tend to be cool. But it's not always the case. Sometimes they have spectacular fires. And I was really worried, that old cottage there with the thatched roof, I was really worried about that with this fire. But that's the sort of fire we want for Fynbos restoration. A nice hot fire. We want it to be quick though. It mustn't last for long. But it's got to be nice and hot. And then, of course, we end up with the Fynbos restoring. Like this patch in the core block. And what we're looking at here is passive restoration. We don't have to do anything other than remove the pines and burn it, put in a restoration fire. And this was the big surprise to all of us, because according to the theory, after 100 years under pines, there should have been nothing. So all of this was a miracle. All of it was unexpected. And the big question that we're still trying to grapple with is, why is it that these seed banks survived at Tokai? So that's the passive side. The moment we started getting to restoration, we realized that passive wouldn't work all the way. And one of the reasons why it won't work is because of all the species that store the seeds in the canopy. And when the canopy is dead, because the plants die because of the shaded pines, those seed banks are lost, and that's it, they're gone. We'd have to bring them in. So these are the ones we started off bringing in. Proteus it's doing very nicely in the Stone Church block. There's some lovely populations there. Elsewhere, Tokai, it's not doing so well. But there's one area which is doing very well. Leucodendron McOwenii, the wattle leaf conebush. It's called the wattle leaf conebush because the hack groups keep on hacking it because it looks like a wattle. And that's been a problem at Tokai. Both working for water and working for wetlands have come in and have chopped down some of our plants. But it's still doing okay in some of the wetlands. The Protea repens and Leucodendron laureolum are doing spectacularly well. Some say they're doing too well and are now a security threat. We certainly didn't expect them to grow so large. They were supposed to be waist-high plants. And why they're so large, we surmise because there's nutrients in the soil, and we need more fires to get rid of those nutrients, and then they'll become a bit smaller, a bit more dwarf, and a feature to have. But they are doing absolutely fantastically. And then down at the bottom here, Leucodendron levisanus, which is one of our really threatened species, which Anthony Hitchcock planted extensively in one of the blocks. And they did absolutely fantastically, and they were brilliant, except that now the felt's too old and they've almost all died. So because this is a serotinous, there's no seed bank, we'll probably have to restore them there. It is a funny species. Those seeds might be a bit more long-lived than for the other serotinous species. We don't know, so we'll be watching that. But yeah, so this was a success, but we need to burn more often. We think 15 years is a bit too long. We need to perhaps reduce it to 10 years. And then we also knew that the resprouters would be a problem because these plants resprout. They don't make seed banks. So when they get shaded out by the pines, the seed banks are too small and they don't blast through. We expected that. And as a rule, that's true. Very few of these have actually come up spontaneously from the passive restoration. This is what we targeted. Protea acornus, we never could get enough viable seeds for. So that never got going. And we'd like to bring it in, but we'll need to find a place that's got decent seed set. The two cerurias, the Weinberg Cerurea and the Trident Cerurea spiderheads. They are doing fantastically wherever we've planted them, so they're not an issue. They're doing great, as is Erica mimosa. Almost all the Erica mimosa plants that we've actually planted have survived, which is amazing. And the Leucospermum hyperphylocarpodendron, it's also done reasonably well in a few places. And total failure has been the king protea. We've grown them, they've grown fantastically, but every single plant has been chopped down by working for water. They chop them, they cut them off at the base, and they poison them. So at present, there's none left. Both in block A, block A15 where they used to occur, and in the restoration trail, they've actually come and killed them, which is a total tragedy. And then the other species we knew we'd have to concentrate on are the wetland species. We brought in lots of Mimetes hirtus, the marsh pagoda. Unfortunately, when we planted in the one wetland, we had a heavy frost 3 days later, and the plants weren't hardened yet. So they died. Had the frost come a week later, they probably would have survived. So we lost those. There was a beautiful collection on the restoration trail, but with the drought, they've all died. So the seed banks are there. They'll recover when we burn, but I can't see sandbox burning the restoration trail. So we'll have to see what comes up there. We've got a few plants scattered throughout the park, but not enough for a viable population. I've discussed Leucodendron maconi already. The two Ericas have been a great success. Erica verticillata, everyone knows about, and that's been Anthony's particular baby. I won't deal with that anymore. Erica turgida has done very well as well. It's spectacular how well it's done. Unfortunately, it is not a spectacular Erica. That is a stunning photograph. When you see the plants, they don't look like that. So it's a very difficult one to have as a showship or showcase species. So it's doing well. It's extinct in the wild, and it's growing spectacularly at Tokai. So Tokai is its biggest stronghold at present. It's known as the MacDonald Heath because the MacDonald in Kenilworth is on top of the site where it used to be. And it's doing okay at Tokai. Okay, so that's what we knew we had to do. We've been busy now for 15 years from the restoration, from the 2005 when that first block came out. And how far have we got? Well, this is the data you guys have collected in our surveys. And well done, everyone. That's absolutely spectacular. And we do have data from the plantations and from the picnic sites, but I'm not including them in this story. We've got 12,000 observations of 954 species. Now, before you say, but you said there were only 500. No, this is all species. This is animals and insects and everything else as well. So we see over here, we've got, oh, you guys are hiding my numbers. And we've got 600 and something plant species, of which 505 are indigenous. And then we've got invertebrates, 145 species of invertebrate and 45 species of fungi as well. Okay, time for the quiz. You guys can't sleep and just relax. What of these species over here, these are the most common ones, Sourfig and the Blombos, in order of importance. So the importance of being recorded. Which species is the only one that occurs in every single block at Tokai? You can answer on the chat and see if you get it right. Come on. Let's see who gets it right first. Alana, I can't see the chat. You're going to have to check and see who gets the answer right. So, which species is the only species that occurs in every single one of our blocks at Tokai?
Nigel says Metalasia densa.
Nigel's been involved on the surveys. That's how he knows. That's right. Metalasia densa is the only one.
A couple of people have said Pelargonium.
Yes, okay. The Pelargonium likes it. So I just neglected to point out, there are our blocks again. So this data is for each block. We have data for every single block, and we can do all sorts of scientific analysis and fun stuff. As I said in my summary, this is an absolutely fantastic resource. We can see there's our two proteas, the ones that we're restoring. They're doing fantastically. They're up in the most common ones. Pelargonium cucullatum is a resprouter. It comes up like mad. Carpobrotus, I presume the baboons brought it in initially, but it's doing very well, especially in the cooler fires. And then Metalasia densa and Corymbosa are the two dominants right now at Tokai. These are the two species that dominate most of the area. We've got three Synesios, the sunfelt ragwort, the kill ragwort, and the garden root one, which is the alien. It's there as well. And then we've got our P, Aspalathus retroflexa, which is by far the most common P, especially in the early cereal stages. And then we've got two oxalises, which represent the bulbs. They're the only two bulbs in the stop list. And then two pelargoniums, capitatum and cucullatum. Capitatum is killed by fire, but cucullatum is a resprouter. So it comes up from an underground rootstock. Okay, so a little bit of science. I've got to include a little bit of science in there. So this is the number of species of all the plants and animals we've got at Tokai. There we can see our core site, 212 species. And there we can see our old patch and our young patch in that block A18. So twice as many in the area that wasn't very long-lived before they harvested. But just look at the numbers. The core area is not just there. The core area actually extends right over, right over across the road into the stub. So this whole area here is core area. We've got more than 200 species in each one of those blocks, which is absolutely stunning. And then we can see other numbers there. We need to go and do A1 and do a proper survey there. Notice there's lots of species in the pines as well. Okay, so yes, okay, they include things like sparrowhawks and chaffinches and squirrels. But yeah, the plantations do have life in them. And then if we look at the other side of the coin, how many species are only found in one block? You'll see there's 26 species are only found in the pine block, so the squirrel and the chaffinch and that. Our core area has got 31 species, but we've got a few other sites that are as good or nearly close to it. So this area here has got 30 species, 26, 40. This first one to come out, in fact, has got more species than the core block. So we've got a whole lot of cases here where the unique species, and this poses a problem to us because so many of these patches have species that are confined to them. It becomes a problem of everything's a bit bitty, everything's a bit spread out, and we can't afford to lose any particular bit. Everything has to be managed very carefully. There's not a lot of redundancy in here, and it's going to take a while before these species spread out and colonize and become more evenly spread out over the whole area. And that's the important bit. We've got to nurture this and keep this careful while the population numbers are low, so that they can build up to the minimum viable populations and become a viable proposition. Okay, so that's the end of the science. I'm just going to take us through a nostalgic ramble through the different Fynbos blocks and what we learned from a few of them. And we're going to start off with A14C, which you remember from the aerial photograph was the first one out. It was harvested in 2005 and it was never burnt. This is the view of it looking across through to the Hottentos Holland there. So this is block A14 here. In 2007, 2 years after it was cleared, and we can see there the Synesia pterophora has died. It has come in, it's flowered, and it's busy on its way out. Notice that block A13 is still there. If we look at the same view 3 years later, there it is. We can see the metallasias and the passerinas, the blombos and the chona are beginning to dominate, and block A13 is now gone. But the problem with this block not having burnt, as you can see over here, look at all the aliens. Alien grasses, alien plants are a major problem. We need a hot fire to get rid of those aliens. This is just the view looking across there. We can see it's aging nicely. We're getting the species coming through. But again, lots and lots of aliens amongst them. And what we find is when we burn, we don't have that problem. There's our Pelargonium cucullatum. For those interested. And then in the center, I don't know if you notice it anymore because it's grown up and it's not so visible anymore. In 2008, we put these in. These are exclosure plots because we had the offer of introducing some Grijsbok into Tokai Park. They were from Milnerton. There were too many. They thought they had 24. They ended up with over 36, but the carrying capacity is only 6. So they had to get rid of them in quickly, and they offered us some. And we said, great. Approach Sand Parks. Management said, fantastic, we'll take them. We just need approval from headquarters. So they put in the fences and everything was ready. And 6 months later, long after the grasbok had been sold, head office in Kruger came and said, yes, of course you can have them, but you must put a 16,000 rand collar on each one. Now you can get a pair of grasbok for 1,000 rand, and to have to find 45,000 that we'd have to find to put collars on them, that was out of the question. So I'm afraid we never got around to getting the grasbok, but we have our enclosure plots. And there we are looking at the 2010. You can see how things are growing up around it. There's our enclosure plot. You can see there's nothing eating on the inside or the outside. We don't have any bucket Tokai. But the plots are still there. Yeah, in 2006, a year after they cleared it, you can see the Synesia terophora looking absolutely spectacular. It came up and it did very well. Thank you very much, without the fire. And of course, one of our problems are we had this huge road over here, and we needed to soften it and to make it nicer and to try and make it look like something other than a long straight stripe. So we contoured it around. Of course, because it hadn't burnt, we had lots of material we could play with, shaping the bars, getting everything looking nice. This is what it looked like in 2010. If you want to see what it looks like now, you can go there yourself. I'm just going to show you older pictures. I'm not showing more recent stuff, but you can see how nicely it filled in and how people stayed on the paths and how it's worked quite well. We've discussed the serotinous species. And just to point out, this is where Kirsten Bosch did a lot of the experimental work, experimental plantings. And Leucadendron levisanus was one that was an absolutely stunning success. It grew, it produced huge numbers of seeds and big stuff. But because the veld is now too old, at 15 years, they've all died. And we need to think about fire management at Tokai and how to do it. Now, Sandparks doesn't want to burn too often because that's too much work. So we need to see how we can get them interested and how we can get them to adopt a slightly more frequent burning cycle. Just again, to reiterate, you don't burn, the aliens dominate and take over. You really need a hot fire to get rid of that grasses, the alien annual grasses. Okay, I suppose I really shouldn't have started there. I should have started on this little patch over here, which I'm calling the Ellioti block. And this is a patch that we started on 2006. This is the Ellioti block. If you look over here, that's the Berlin Wall in the background. We're looking east. And this was the plantation where the owls used to breed. And the young used to sit there, and they used to have to close it off from the dogs so that the owlets, cygnets, whatever they called, could breed. This is now where the boardwalk runs. This here is the core block. This is what it looked like in the wetlands. It was just dense acacia moonshine, and year later, this is what it looked like. Thanks to the hard work of James Forsyth and his band of merry men who cleared the aliens. This is the view from the other side. So now we're on the other side of the Sitflay wetlands, and we're looking now over on the core site. And this is that wetland they cleared. This was all just solid black wattle. So that was cleared. That was absolutely a great job. What we did is we did an adopter plot system after they cleared. There you can see all the stumps. And we came and we cleared the coppice and we cleared the seedlings and we pulled them, and each group had a block that they ran down to the wetlands and that we used to clear. And then James organized for plants, and we came in and we planted the plants. So notice all this big area of nice, lovely turf. It really should have been burnt, but that was not an option right next to the wetland. So we came in and we planted all these species which were obtained, I think, from Rondaflay nursery. And we planted them in there. So thanks to James for getting hold of all those stuff. And we planted them all throughout this whole area. It was only a year later that we discovered our mistake. And that is that this is a wetland. And now without the aliens there and without the pine trees behind us, it just filled up with water. And where we planted our plants, they all drowned, and it became a typho wetland, the bulrush wetland. So a lot of effort, a lot of work, but it was an important lesson for us that, you know, just because the land looks dry after it comes out from aliens, it doesn't mean that that's what it actually is. This is wetland, and it's gone back to being a wetland. All it needed was for the aliens to be removed. This is also where Anthony planted some of his first Erica plants in there, and these were very successful. Again, notice the grasses and the sedges. They totally overtopped the little Ericas, but these are hardy little characters, and they managed to survive and they managed to get growing despite the fact that everything else was growing like mad. So yeah, at a stage we were worried that they'd all be killed by this other growth, but they managed quite well. Other major problem we had, of course, was with Artemis. It came and it ate them all, it chopped them down to the ground. It was a very easy solution. We got the snakes that had been captured in the horse paddocks and horse nursery, horse areas, and we released them here at Tokai, and of course that caused an immediate public outcry. How on earth can you release snakes where people are walking? Yeah, so totally irresponsible. And the fact that previously they'd released them all in the Arboretum didn't seem to strike anyone as strange. So yeah, whether that helped or not, we're not certain. And another lesson we learned over here was be careful of what you plant. Not all plants are friendly. So this is Clifortia polygonifolia, I think. Sorry, yeah, Clifortia ferruginea, and there it is, and you can see it totally took over. So that is a species that definitely we should not use in any future plantings because it's growing through and over and above everything else, and it's now become dominant in parts of those areas. The only thing that can survive this looks like it's Erica verticillata. But yeah, so be careful what you plant, but how you know this beforehand, heaven knows. And then everything wasn't plain sailing. MTO leased out the fire break cutting to a private organization, and somebody forgot to tell them that this was no longer the fire belt. We'd moved the fire belt to over there, and this is where we'd planted our Erica verticillata, and they came through and they just bulldozed our Erica verticillata and mowed it. That is the palmite patch. So that's our one big wetland at Tokai. So they came right through the wetland and took out a whole lot of our Erica verticillata. Fortunately, we planted in this whole area and they were all quite happy. I don't remember this, but obviously it must have been a spectacular display in October 2010. And hopefully if it gets wet enough or if we have another fire, we'll have another spectacular display of that. And then also the Gladiolus Watsonia hoides, is it? Watsonia, Mariana. It's doing spectacularly over there. Okay, I'd like to go move on to our big block. This was the big one we did in 2010, and it consists of a whole series of blocks that Sandparks did together. A15, A and B, A16 in 2 parts, and A18 in 2 parts. This was our big restoration effort. This is what that dense old 40-year-old pine plantation looked like. See, there's nothing underneath compared to what the previous picture I showed you. And then if you compare it to the corridor, which ran over there, which has got a lot more, with our one leucospermum plant that we tried to protect. So this is what that corridor looked like. It was much more open, and we had a lot more growth in there. In fact, 2 Erica species that were here never came up after the burn. So we don't know if their seed banks are still there or if they just didn't produce any seed banks. But we will monitor in the future and see if anything comes up. So Erica subdivaricata was one of it. It's not a rare species, but would have been nice to have them more common in the area. And our leucospermum, we were hoping for seeds, but it didn't produce seeds, or else the fire wasn't suitable for seeds, which I doubt. But we had this plant. We were worried that that tree there, they would damage the plant with it. And they assured us, no ways, don't worry, your plant is safe. So we put danger tape around this plant to keep it safe. They chopped that tree down without any hassle, and it didn't affect the tree. But one of the other trees they chopped down went straight over the thing. And then to top it all, they rode the tractor over it, totally over it. So it was totally killed. It didn't stand a chance. So yeah, unfortunately, no matter how much you look after and how much efforts you make, sometimes it just doesn't work. We also learned over here how to manage Acacia melanoxylon, the blackwood. And here you can see all this is one plant. There is the oldest plant, the elective. But here you can see the roots running, and all along the roots, you can see the plants coming up. And likewise along there, and another root running through that way. And then there's another one running along there. So this is all one plant. And it turned out this was very easy to control. You can see here the old attempts at controlling it, these old stumps here by MTO. They came through, they cut it down, they poisoned it, and it came up like a hedge again. So the secret is to choose this one plant and you frill it. So you keep the plant alive, but you stop it from feeding the roots. And then all these others you chop off and you stump treat them to ground level. So that kills this root. And the plant thinks it's okay because this plant is alive, but it's not feeding the roots. And provided you make sure that none of these produce leaves to feed the roots again, the roots die, and when the roots die, the plant dies. So it took about 2 years, but that plant has disappeared and hasn't shown any signs of coming up again. So in 2010, they started clearing. Here we are busy clearing the last little patch. They left that little corridor for last because the timber was young and wasn't as good as the older timber, and then they burnt. Sandparks was sneaky. Block A15, they sneaked in early in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, because the forecast was for rain later that morning and they wanted to burn before the rains. Well, they managed about half an hour of fire before the rain put out their fire. So they didn't burn very clean. You can see here large amounts of material left behind, lots and lots of pine cones, all of which made pine babies. And so A15 wasn't a very good fire in terms of the restoration. By contrast, A18 and A16, which they did, they inadvertently chose the driest day of the year. The humidity on that day was down to 20%. Their fire burnt spectacularly, but at 4 o'clock, they couldn't put it out. So they made the mistake of bringing in the helicopter, and of course, everybody thought the fire was out of control, lots of bad publicity. But in fact, all it was is they wanted to knock off at 5 o'clock, and so they needed some way of putting out this fire so that they could do it. Well, because of the humidity, because of the thing, they were not successful. The fire got into the pine stumps and got underground. And what you're seeing here are the smoldering furnaces, ovens underground of the wood burning. And they couldn't put that out. This smoldered for 3 days. We had an inversion. It smoked out the whole of the southern suburbs, all the way to Rondevlei. I don't know how far north it went. Certainly the whole of the southern suburbs. And for 3 or 4 days, everything stank and was just smoke and burning eyes and really unpleasant. The politicians got involved and tried to stop any future burns and all sorts of things. But from the point of view of the Fynbos, this was a fantastic fire. Nice and clean, no debris left around. This is what we want, except, of course, we don't want it to burn for 4 or 5 days. Okay, so this was our most involved one. We did tons of stuff. We had to go and source material. Some of it we had to go as far as Darling because the species are extinct south of Darling. So we had to go trace these and find them and bring them and cultivate them. And this is where Anthony and Kirsten Bosch got involved. They planted and got all the stuff going and got them ready for planting. The Sorotana species we did straight away. This is us planting the Leucadendron laureolum and the Proteorepens. And we went there, Sarah Lee, my intern, we went and we planted. And our strategy was quite simple. She walked to transect and I walked to transect. So there she walked and she planted the Leucadendron laureolum. And there I walked and I planted the Proteorepens. And then we went and she did the Proteorepens and I did the Leucadendron laureolum. So we planted them in 4 lines so that we could monitor the progress. You can see the wind obviously dispersed them quite a little bit. But look at how there are patches where we had low recruitment, high recruitment, and patches where there's absolutely nothing. Sorry. So, and then over here as well, you can see another transect there, and another one there, and there. So we can monitor this and see how and why it worked. We still don't quite know why it didn't come up in some patches. Everything looks suitable, and there's going to have to be lessons learned from this. But this is where the monitoring and methods come. And I bet that even though you've all walked there, none of you knew that these had been planted in straight stripes. This is also where we planted in A18 the Erica turgida, and you can see why it's not that much of a spectacular plant. And there, that's what the plant looks like. And we did monitoring with Anthony in October last year. We went out and we couldn't find the stuff for about half an hour. Only after half hour did we see the first plants. And then we stuck flags in because we didn't want to double count. So we put flags on each of the plants. And then when we'd spent about 2 hours looking for plants, we just decided, okay, let's go collect the flags. That'll tell us how many plants there were. And we kept on saying, hey, here's a flag without any plants. And Anthony would say, look properly. And yeah, sure enough, there'd be a plant there. And so, yeah, so there's about 40, 50 plants at Lower Tokai. It's probably our most successful restoration species at this stage. And then it threw up a major surprise. We had these dense stands of Acacia saligna coming up in A16, just one of the blocks. per meter squared. There were some where we had up to 500 seedlings per meter squared. And this is a bit later. You can see they're beginning to go yellow. I'll come to that in a moment. And the question is, what on earth are we going to do with this? If we bring in poison, we'll kill all the fynbos plants. So we didn't want to bring in poison, but how do we tackle a problem like this? So we called on Woody, so Alan Wood from the PPRI. He came along and he had these bags of powder and this blower, and he had the Acacia saligna, the Port Jackson fungus. And this powder he mixed with the fungus, he put it in this, and then he wandered around the area spraying with this powder. You can see he's using a GPS so that he knows that he covers the whole area, and he needed this metal thing here for static. Otherwise, static builds up in the motor, and then instead of it making a powder, it just makes little droplets, which, not little droplets, little clumps, which don't disperse. So he had to be grounded, and he walked up and down the area, spraying the whole area with this powder. The nice thing about this is that it doesn't affect any other single plant. So it was going to attack the Port Jacksons and nothing else. We had some areas we covered so that we could see what the effects of the powder, the fungus were. And it probably was not a success. We don't know. In that summer, all the Port Jacksons turned yellow and dropped their leaves. And we think that might have been the fungus. And we think we might have over-fungused it. So they were reacting, they dropped their leaves. Once they dropped the leaves, they just continued growing. And the question then is, what on earth happened? Here we can see the blocks. There's nothing that we'd walked. We didn't expect that this block would have lots of Port Jacksons in. There was nothing to tell us that that might have happened. Even after the clearing, there was nothing to suggest that this block was special. It was only after the fire, and only after we looked at the satellite photographs of the fire, that we discovered that there are all these little lines running down in this block and in this block only. And they're 1 yard across and I think 15 yards apart. And we suspect that this is one of the blocks in which they experimented with using Port Jackson to add nitrogen to the soil because their pines weren't doing so well. But we've got no confirmation of that yet. We're trying to find records that might help us, but we really don't know what the issue was there. Okay, and of course, it came up spectacularly. They are the Pelargonium cucullatus. The stalkspurs, the resprouter came up. Notice here in the foreground, the hot fire, and there in the background, the much cooler fire in block A15 when they tried to burn when it rained. Okay, just a few other things. And the Prinskasteel Wetlands, that's that area there. And that's a view of it, of what it looked like when there were pines around. We planted Erica verticillata here, and this was our biggest planting of Erica verticillata. So we had 3 separate strains, one from Kirstenbosch, one from Vienna, and one from Pretoria, and we planted them in rows into the wetland. We didn't know what the plants wanted, so we had to go from the dry to the wet and hope that we got the gradient and that they would survive. And then we planted them into the wetlands from the dry to the wet. Just briefly, what happened was they grew the fastest and most spectacularly in the wet areas, but then they got overtaken and shaded out and killed by the other plants. In these areas where they grew a little bit slowly, they survived and did very well. And then in these upper areas that were too dry, they just died. So there was a zonation. They prefer the wet stuff, but they can't compete with the other plants where it's too wet. So there everyone's planting them out, putting them out in the rows. And it wasn't without incidents. So we had slug eaters and we had puff adders. So yeah, the other people helped us with the plantings. And then sandpox came and they sprayed them because they were spraying the brambles. And so they killed a couple of dozen plants, which was a nuisance. But on the whole, this was a grand success. You can see the plants out there and going all the way up through over there in the wetland. And we will see. These pines are now harvested. This area was supposed to be burnt this year, but because of the COVID, they didn't do any burning. So hopefully this one will be burnt next year. And then we'll see what the restoration does, see how well these plants survive the restoration. So there they are going down the Prinskasteel wetland. Okay. Orpen East block, where's my thing? It doesn't show where they are. That's this block over here, sorry. I don't know what happened to my block. And that's this block over here, which we burnt. It was interesting because there were quite a few patches of natural stuff surviving underneath. We don't know why. They came in, they brought other material when they harvested because their trucks got stuck in the sand. They couldn't drive through the sand. They needed clay. And then they burnt. It was a nice hot fire. This was the first time that we actually had to close paths and roads. So we did that. One of the things that was memorable about Block A13 was the big stand, the den stand we discovered under the pines of the French broom. So the French broom was there. It was a really big den stand. We had to go in and clear it. And the problem with this one is that it's allergenic. So one's got to be careful. And one can't just go and harvest it. But what we did is after the fire, we brought in a team of people to go and look for any young. And we did pulled a couple of thousand young out. And that effectively has got rid of that infestation. So it's no longer a problem in Lower Tokai. It's still a problem in the horse paddocks and at the manor house. But down here, it's no longer a problem. There you can see the Synesia terrophora coming in after the fire. These are the only two plants of the species, Tabaroa at Tokai. They're still there, and they're still the only two plants, and they're both the same sex. So we're going to have to make a plan to try and get them to breed. We had this one, the Karkar. That was growing in under the pines. They did fine. It came up nicely after the fire, but someone came and dug up half of them. So they're still there, but there's not that many around. You can see we do have some aliens, even though it was a hot fire, but on the whole, it's much nicer, clearer stuff. What's strange about this block is that we had a whole lot of resprouting species and non-resprouting species like this. This is Macrostylus resprouter. We don't know why, but this is the only place at Tokai that it actually has come up, and the same with the Osma. This is the only place that it's come up so far. So there's quite a few species that we don't understand why they're doing so well at Tokai. Now, our biggest problem at present is that we're beginning to discover what the communities are. And so I've just highlighted our communities here. And it's just preliminary. We've got to work it out far more carefully. This is just based on the Restios. And if we look over here, this is our Restio capensis communities, which is our biggest one in this top corner. And this is where the Brunsviges and the Bloblomachisalis occur most. This block over here is the Restio biofarius, the prong cape reed. We don't know why it's there. It was heavily hammered by the drought. A lot of plants died back. They weren't killed, but they died back, and they're recovering now with the more wet again. And so we've got that funny community over there. This is the community of the Diastella, and it is associated with Wildernovia and sulcata, the groovy sunreed. And we can see we've got two big patches of it over here. Now, this is a problem because we thought, and we've done our estimations based on the fact that this is a reasonably nice habitat for Diastella, but it's confined to this community as far as we can work out. So instead of us having our minimum of 2,500 plants over this whole area, it's over a much smaller area, and we've got to be careful how we manage the minimum viable populations. We need a viable population, and this community, while the community diversity is great, it also means that we have smaller size for some of the species in the communities, those that are confined to communities. So we need to play around with some more. There's some more Diastella in here. So this becomes a crucial area for having a large enough area for the Diastella. And that's same with some of the other species. This patch over here is dominated by Masterziella digitata, which is an interesting one. It's not so common on the rest of the Cape Flats. And then we've got Restio tetragonus in this area. That's a wetland. That is a spectacular wetland, and the Restio tetragonus is there. So we'll see what else comes up in that wetland and as time goes on. So this is our problem. It's all a numbers game. Sorry, these others are the principal wetlands. It's all a numbers game. We need to keep up our numbers. We need to get the populations viable. We've got more diversity than we thought. And the question is, what do we do with the species that are confined to one community? How do we actually keep viable populations going? And that's going to be our biggest problem and the threat to the conservation of this area in the future. Okay, I should stop. My time's up and thing, but I'm just going to just ramble on a little bit more, just for another few minutes. Just bear with me. There we've got the canal. You remember the Bangalay gums and that spectacular walks we used to go through underneath there. It was the A14 after it had been cleared, and the walks we used to do along the river, along the stream. And then in January, this is still flooding. As the trees were harvested high up, it flowed for longer and longer, and the bridge over it. Yeah, and then of course the time came had to be removed. Well, it was sad, but now they've gone, and now we've got our Fynbos back. We had to put in a few bridges. Here we are putting a bridge over the canal in the corner. That's A14 over there in the background. Thanks to everyone who was involved. If you want to see that view, let's just check there. See that brown bush over there? That is this asparagus, and that is where the bridge is now. So that was block A15. It's now been harvested, and we now walk up that road, come up here and go there. This has now been totally grown over and closed up. So the path comes across there. So it's changed dramatically. I'm sure you guys can remember the fun times we used to have in the plantations. Of course, we had to build in a few gabions to stop erosion. This was the first one they built. Absolutely spectacular. There goes the path there. They built the gabion. Only problem is that they didn't build it low enough. Now, I don't know if they were waiting for Noah's flood or whatever, but I mean, yeah, that's what happens when you don't build it low enough. It just goes around the sides. So they had to come in and they had to lower the gabion to make it work. That's just the view from the top. Down the gabion, that was our first gabion. They're the initial plantings that they planted, and just inspecting the plantings there. And of course, Working for Water came and they cleared out all the plants they didn't plant, which included lots of species that were regenerating, which is a total blow. Never mind. The bigger problem was down over here where the water in the canal was undermining the hard bank. See that bank over there, that hard layer? That is the ferrycrete layer, and it occurs at the edge of the water table. So the area above dries out in summer and the area below usually stays wet. So this was undermining it, and what this is effectively doing is it's dropping the water table in the whole area by allowing this to happen. So they needed to do something, and so they built this humongous gabion. I'm sure you can all remember it. Why it had to be so big, I have no idea, but the engineers assured us it had to be that big. So this huge hole was made. I don't know why they didn't just make it lower down where they didn't need to make a hole. So they made this and they did the spectacular gabion. And of course, there was this huge mound left afterwards. And what do we do with all the soil that got dug out from the gabion? And there are various plans to use it for all sorts of stuff. But in the end, nothing happened. And it just stood there until the pines were harvested in 2010. And of course, now it's the lookout tower. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions, and I'm also going to unmute everybody so people can ask their questions if they want to. So please just speak out if you'd like to. Our first question is from Jerry Carlo, and he asks, first of all, a suggestion, maybe consider exclusion plots for the species that are confused with alien plants. So to protect any very precious planted things from working for water teams. That's one suggestion. And then a question, in what conditions do Erica turgida, or does Erica turgida seem to survive in? Looks like they're doing great.
Erica turgida likes wet conditions, so it doesn't occur in the really dry soil. So the areas we targeted were the actual areas which show signs of being wet for about 2-3 months of the year. So totally waterlogged, totally soggy at that time of the year, and then dry for the rest of the year. And those are the areas it likes best. We did plant them elsewhere in dry areas, but they've all died in the dry areas. Can I just come back to the exclusion plots? We're trying to manage this as an ecosystem. So we don't want to do areas where we manage individual species in particular places. We'd rather find out where they do well and where they survive, and then they've got to look after themselves there. And as for the managing people who should know better and who hack stuff like the king proteas and the wattle leaf gum bushes, cone bushes, I'm afraid we need to train them. That's the only way to do it. But even if you put in exclusion plots, they'll go in and they'll clear the aliens inside the exclusion plots, and that will include the stuff. So yeah, it's always a problem.
Thanks. We've got a question from John Yeld. When are the last pines going to be removed?
The answer to that is simple: 2024, unless parkscapes have their way, and the way it's going, parkscapes are going to have their way. So the answer is we don't know. in theory, it's no longer a viable economic proposition. So what MTO are planning to do or whatever, I don't know. Sandparks will hold them to task because the contract says they have to remove it. But then we've got the Parkscape situation, which might, Parkscape might decide to buy out the plantation or force Sandparks to manage it as a plantation. We don't know. But the long-term plan is that it should be removed, and we need to get, specifically, we need to try and get that one patch of the diastella. We need to try and get that because of the need to get the populations up, keep the population and diversity up. But yeah, sorry, John, we don't have a clue. It's all hanging in the air.
And lockdowns also put a bit of a spanner in the works, because this year was supposed to be the public participation process, and now we're not sure when that will be. So we've got a question from Sarah Schumann. I don't know, Sarah, if you'd like to unmute your mic, if you want to maybe ask your question yourself, or if you want me to read it. Okay, Sarah, I'll just read your question, but just jump in if you want to ask it. She asked, do you think national biodiversity targets are too low? And are the targets effective in conserving biodiversity?
Yes, the targets are far too low, but I'm afraid the population's too large, and we have to lower the targets. We just have to be realistic. It's a catch-22. We've got lots of people. The people need to be looked after. We need to look after our biodiversity. But when it comes to people versus biodiversity, we know what's going to happen. So we need to be very careful about what we've got and defend what we've got and be logical and scientific and get backing and have everything justifiable so that we can defend it. But yes, the targets are too low, but then the world population is far too high. So if we reduce the world's population by about 1/3 to 1/2, then there's no problem. We can raise the conservation targets and we can look after species. But yeah, unfortunately, we can't do that. So, or fortunately, we can't do that. So I'm afraid, yeah, biodiversity is going to lose out, and what we've got to do is we've got to try and make sure that we can conserve as much as possible, as efficiently as possible, for as long as possible.
Thank you. Sarah says thanks. Are there any other questions? You can just unmute your mic and ask it, or you can type it in the chat. Maybe while people are thinking, I just had a question. It's my understanding that Lower Tokai Park is prime development property. It would be a great plot of land for some of the local politicians to put low-cost housing on. And my understanding is that one of the main reasons it's protected is because of the exceptional biodiversity. We have, 550 native plant species in some of those plots, and that's of global significance. So the highest level of protection it can have is as a conservation site. So if pines are replanted in those areas, wouldn't that have implications for low-cost housing developments? Wouldn't it lose its protection status?
Yeah, as it stands at present, sandparks cannot conserve plantations. So it can only go into the national park if it is natural vegetation. And the national park is the highest legislation we've got for conservation in the country. So if it goes into the park, then it's relatively safe compared to all other means. But of course, never totally safe. But if it doesn't go into the national parks, then yes, it's available for anyone who comes up with some harebrained scheme for anything, for some sort of garden or some sort of activity or a school, or low-cost housing or anything. So yeah, the ideal would be to get it into a high-level conservation thing.
Yeah,
and that's the only way it's got a long-term conservation future.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And I think that's pretty much what our Friends of Tokai Park committee is really passionate about, is conserving this biodiversity and stopping species extinction. And yeah, we've got all of that on our website. Our vision is very clearly laid out. So people can feel free to go and have a look there if you have any more questions about that. So on that note, I just wanted to thank Tony Rebelo for giving that really interesting and nostalgic tour of Tokai Park. I definitely have many memories of running around there as a child. So thank you very much for that. If anyone has further questions and you don't want to ask them right now, you can always pop us an email and we'll do our best to answer your questions. At this point, we just want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you so much for your time, and we'd like to officially close this meeting. I did promise at the start that I'd pull up our banking details again, just to ask for your donations. If you think what we're doing is great and you'd like to contribute towards it, please consider making an annual, small annual donation in lieu of membership fees. So thank you everybody very much, and we hope to see you on one of our hacks or walks in the near future.